The USB drive arrived in my office mail slot with no accompanying note, just a piece of masking tape with 2009-2014 written in black marker. I almost threw it away, assuming it was junk or a mistake, but something made me plug it into my computer. What I found was a folder containing architectural blueprints, construction permits, and photographs of buildings I recognized immediately. They were my buildings, structures I'd designed between 2009 and 2014 when I was a rising star in Recife's architecture scene, winning awards for innovative residential towers that transformed the city's skyline. Except these blueprints weren't quite right. They showed modifications I'd never approved, structural changes I'd never designed, alterations that violated every safety code and engineering principle I'd learned in 20 years of practice. And attached to each modified blueprint was a photograph of a collapsed apartment, a cracked foundation, a structural failure that had killed someone. 17 buildings, 43 deaths. All my designs, all compromised, all hiding a secret I was never supposed to discover. At the bottom of the folder was a single text file that read, "You designed monuments to progress. We turned them into tombs. The foundations of Recife are built on sand and lies. Ask yourself why your buildings keep falling." A former employee. I am Leonardo Andrade, 55 years old, one of Brazil's most celebrated architects, the man who helped design modern Recife's vertical expansion. And I just discovered that my legacy is built on corpses. Recife, the Venice of Brazil, a city of bridges and canals, of colonial architecture mixed with modern towers, of mangroves and beaches, and a skyline that climbs higher every year. I'd been part of that climb since the early 2000s, designing residential buildings for the city's growing middle class, structures that promised waterfront living and urban convenience at prices people could afford. My architecture firm, Andrade and Associates, had designed over 30 buildings in Recife between 2005 and 2020. And I'd become wealthy and respected, featured in magazines, invited to speak at universities, considered an example of Brazilian talent competing with international standards. But the USB drive suggested that at least 17 of my buildings had been structurally compromised during construction, modified from my original designs in ways that made them unsafe. And between 2009 and 2023, those 17 buildings had experienced catastrophic failures. A balcony collapse in 2011 that killed 4 people at a New Year's party. A foundation failure in 2013 that caused an entire wing of an apartment building to sink 3 meters, killing 12 residents. A roof collapse during heavy rain in 2016 that crushed 7 people. Structural cracks that appeared suddenly, causing evacuations and condemnations. And throughout it all, I'd assumed these were isolated incidents, construction defects, acts of God. I'd never connected them to my designs because I'd trusted that my blueprints were being followed, that the construction companies I worked with were implementing my specifications exactly as drawn. The USB drive proved otherwise. Someone had systematically altered my designs, removing reinforcing steel, using substandard concrete, cutting corners that saved money but compromised structural integrity. And someone had been documenting this for years, collecting evidence of a conspiracy so vast it involved construction companies, municipal inspectors, corrupt engineers, and possibly officials at the highest levels of Recife's building department. I spent the night going through every file on the drive, cross-referencing the modified blueprints with my original designs, calculating the structural implications of each change. What I discovered made me physically ill. The modifications weren't random cost-cutting. They were systematic, strategic, designed to create buildings that would appear stable for years, but would eventually fail under specific conditions. Heavy rain weakening compromised foundations, weight accumulation on balconies designed for half their actual load, roof structures that couldn't handle water accumulation. These buildings were time bombs, engineered to fail eventually but not immediately, allowing the construction companies to collect their profits and move on before the consequences became apparent. And I, Leonardo Andrade, celebrated architect, had unknowingly designed the blueprints that were then corrupted into instruments of death. The realization that my career was built on buildings that killed people was crushing. But worse was the knowledge that more of my compromised designs were still standing, still occupied, still waiting to fail and kill whoever was unlucky enough to be inside when they did. I made a list of the 17 buildings documented on the USB drive and mapped them across Recife. They were concentrated in the Boa Viagem neighborhood, the beachfront district where I'd done most of my work in the 2009-2014 period. Luxury apartments marketed to upper-middle-class families, with ocean views and modern amenities, advertised as symbols of Recife's economic growth and urban sophistication. The photos on the USB drive showed the aftermath of failures. Rescue workers pulling bodies from collapsed structures, families standing in front of condemned buildings, holding everything they owned in plastic bags, engineers inspecting massive cracks that had appeared overnight. Each incident had been reported in the news as tragic accidents, investigated by authorities who'd concluded they were isolated construction defects, compensated through insurance payouts and legal settlements that kept everything quiet. No pattern had been identified, no conspiracy suspected, just a series of unfortunate incidents in a city growing faster than its regulatory systems could handle. But the USB drive showed the pattern clearly. 17 buildings, all designed by me, all modified during construction by the same 3 construction companies, all inspected and approved by municipal inspectors who'd signed off on work that violated obvious safety codes. The conspiracy involved dozens of people, all of whom had benefited financially from cutting corners, and all of whom had kept silent as people died. I didn't know who'd sent me the drive or why. But I knew I had to investigate before more of my buildings failed and more people died because of designs I'd created in good faith that had been corrupted by others' greed. The first step was confirming whether the information on the drive was accurate. I needed to see the actual buildings, compare them to both my original designs and the modified blueprints, and determine if the structural compromises were real or fabricated. I started with the nearest building, Torre Atlantica in Boa Viagem, a 20-story residential tower I'd designed in 2009. It had experienced a balcony collapse in 2011 that killed 4 people during a New Year's celebration. The official investigation had concluded that the balcony was overloaded with party guests, exceeding its weight capacity. But the modified blueprint on the USB drive showed that the balcony had been built with half the steel reinforcement I'd specified, making it incapable of holding even a fraction of its designed load. I contacted the building's condominium association, introducing myself as the original architect and requesting permission to conduct a courtesy inspection. The association president, a woman named Marcia, who'd lived in the building since it opened, was eager to have me visit. "We've had problems," she said when I arrived at the building. "Cracks appearing in walls, water infiltration that shouldn't be happening in a building this young, concerns about structural integrity. The construction company says it's normal settling, but it's been 15 years. Shouldn't settling be finished by now?" I toured the building with Marcia and 2 other residents, taking photographs and measurements, comparing what I saw to my original specifications. The differences were stark. Concrete walls that should have been 30 centimeters thick were 20. Support columns that should have been reinforced with high-grade steel contained minimal rebar. Foundation depth that should have extended 5 meters into the sandy soil of Recife barely reached 3. The building was structurally compromised in exactly the ways the modified blueprint indicated. "Marcia," I said carefully, "I need to be honest with you. This building wasn't constructed according to my original design. Significant structural elements were reduced or eliminated during construction. I don't know if it's safe to continue occupying it without a comprehensive structural assessment by an independent engineer." Her face went pale. "Are you saying we need to evacuate? There are 78 families living here." I didn't have the authority to order an evacuation, but I had the moral obligation to warn them. "I'm saying you need to hire a structural engineer immediately, someone not connected to the original construction company, and get a full safety evaluation. Till then, I'd recommend that residents avoid putting excessive weight on balconies, that you monitor any cracks or structural changes carefully, and that you document everything in case legal action becomes necessary." I left my contact information and moved on to the next building on the list, already dreading what I would find. Over the next week, I inspected 8 of the 17 buildings documented on the USB drive. All of them showed the same pattern: systematic reduction of structural elements from my original designs, creating buildings that met minimum appearance standards, but lacked the safety margins necessary for long-term stability. Some were in worse condition than others. Some had already experienced failures. Others were showing warning signs that suggested imminent collapse. And all of them were occupied by families who had no idea they were living in structurally compromised buildings that could fail catastrophically at any time. The question that haunted me was why no one had noticed. I'd worked with these construction companies for years, had trusted them to implement my designs correctly, had never thought to inspect their work because that wasn't typically the architect's role. The construction companies hired their own engineers, municipal inspectors, verified compliance with building codes, and I'd assumed the system worked. But clearly it hadn't. The construction companies had modified my designs to cut costs and increase profits. The municipal inspectors had either been incompetent or bribed to approve substandard work. And I, focused on the creative aspects of architecture and trusting others to handle implementation, had never questioned whether my buildings were being constructed as designed. That trust had killed 43 people so far, and the USB drive suggested more deaths were inevitable unless something changed. I needed to understand the scope of the conspiracy, to identify everyone involved, to find out how deep the corruption went and how many other architects might be in the same position I was, unknowing accomplices to a system that prioritized profit over human safety. I started investigating the 3 construction companies named in the USB drive files: Construtora Nordeste, Empreendimentos Atlântico, and Grupo Mar Construções. All 3 were major players in Recife's construction boom, responsible for dozens of residential towers across the city. All 3 had excellent reputations, strong relationships with the municipal government, and portfolios of successful projects. And all 3, I was now discovering, had histories of cutting corners and paying off inspectors to hide the evidence. I found records of previous investigations that had been quietly closed, lawsuits that had been settled with confidentiality agreements, whistleblowers who'd tried to expose the corruption and been silenced through legal threats or worse. The pattern extended back to the early 2000s, when Recife began its vertical expansion and construction companies realized they could dramatically increase profits by reducing structural elements while maintaining appearances. The system worked because no one was looking comprehensively. Individual building failures were investigated as isolated incidents. Patterns weren't identified because the data wasn't centralized. And architects like me, designing buildings in good faith, never realized our designs were being systematically compromised. But someone had been watching. Someone had spent years documenting the conspiracy, collecting modified blueprints and connecting them to structural failures, building a case that proved systematic corruption in Recife's construction industry. The question was who and why they'd sent it to me now, 15 years after the pattern began. I found the answer when I received a second USB drive, this one delivered to my home address with a note that read, "Meet me at Parque da Jaqueira tomorrow at 2 p.m., alone." Bring both drives. It's time you knew the full truth. Enrique Silva had been my junior architect from 2008 to 2014, a talented designer who'd worked on many of the buildings now documented as compromised. He'd left my firm suddenly in 2014, citing personal reasons, and I'd lost track of him. Now, apparently, he had information that explained everything. I met Enrique at the park the next afternoon, finding him on a bench near the lake, looking older and more worn than I remembered. He was 43 now, thin and nervous, constantly scanning the area as if expecting to be followed. "Leonardo," he said when I sat down, "I'm sorry it took me so long to contact you. I've been scared. They've killed people for knowing less than what I'm about to tell you." He pulled out a laptop and opened files that made the first 2 USB drives look like preliminary sketches. He had everything. Financial records showing bribes paid to municipal inspectors, emails between construction company executives discussing which structural elements could be eliminated without immediate detection, audio recordings of meetings where architects' designs were deliberately modified to cut costs, photographs of inspectors signing off on obviously substandard work. "I discovered this by accident in 2014, Enrique explained. "I was working on the Torre Marina project, and I noticed the construction company was deviating from your specifications. When I questioned it, they told me it was approved modifications, that you'd signed off on changes. But I checked the files, and there was no documentation of your approval, so I started investigating, and I found the pattern. Dozens of buildings where your designs had been compromised, where construction companies were systematically reducing structural elements and paying inspectors to ignore the violations. He showed me documents that proved the conspiracy reached the highest levels of Recife's construction industry and municipal government. Construction company executives who'd made millions in extra profits. Municipal officials who'd received bribes to ensure investigations were cursory. Engineers who'd falsified structural assessments, even some architects who'd been complicit, deliberately designing buildings with minimal safety margins so construction companies could cut additional corners while staying within technical specifications. When I tried to report this in 2014, Enrique continued, I was threatened. Construction company representatives told me that if I went public, they'd make sure I never worked in architecture again, that they'd destroy my career and possibly my life. I was young, scared, and I didn't have the resources to fight them. So I left your firm, left Recife, and spent the next 10 years trying to forget what I'd discovered. He looked at me with haunted eyes. But the buildings kept failing. The death toll kept rising. And I realized I couldn't live with staying silent while people died because of corruption I'd documented but hadn't exposed. So I compiled everything, organized the evidence, and started looking for someone with the credibility and resources to bring this into the light. That's you, Leonardo. You're one of Brazil's most respected architects. Your reputation gives you protection they can't easily destroy. And more importantly, these are your buildings, your designs that were corrupted, your legacy that's been turned into a death trap. If anyone has the moral authority to expose this conspiracy, it's you. I looked through the files he'd compiled, seeing the full scope of the corruption for the first time. It wasn't just 17 buildings. It was over 50 structures across Recife, designed by multiple architects, all compromised in similar ways. The systematic theft of structural integrity in the name of profit, affecting thousands of families who lived in buildings that could fail at any time. How many people have died? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Enrique consulted his records. Documented deaths directly attributable to structural failures in compromised buildings, 137 people between 2009 and 2023. Unknown number of additional deaths from evacuations that led to displacement, from stress-related health problems, from families destroyed by loss of homes. The human cost is incalculable. 137 people, Dead because construction companies wanted to increase profit margins. Dead because municipal inspectors took bribes instead of doing their jobs. Dead because architects like me trusted a system that was thoroughly corrupted. The weight of that knowledge was crushing, but it was also clarifying. I knew exactly what I had to do. "We're going to expose everything," I told Enrique. "All the files, all the evidence, all the names. We're going to bring down this conspiracy even if it destroys my career and reputation. People are living in death traps right now, and we're the only ones who can warn them." Enrique nodded, relief evident on his face. "I was hoping you'd say that. But Leonardo, you need to understand the risk. These people have killed whistleblowers before. They have connections to organized crime, to corrupt police, to officials who will protect them. Going public with this will make you a target." I thought about the 43 people who died in my buildings alone, about the families who'd lost homes and loved ones because I'd trusted others to implement my designs with integrity. "I'm already a target," I said. "I've been one since the moment I unknowingly designed buildings they could corrupt. The only question is whether I die having done nothing or die having told the truth." We spent the next month preparing our case, organizing the evidence into a comprehensive report that documented every aspect of the conspiracy. Construction companies, municipal officials, corrupt inspectors, complicit engineers. We named names, detailed financial transactions, connected structural failures to specific design modifications, proved beyond doubt that Recife's construction boom had been built on systematic corruption that prioritized profit over human safety. Then we sent it everywhere: major newspapers, television networks, federal prosecutors, architectural associations, engineering boards, international media outlets. We published it online, posted it to social media, made sure it couldn't be suppressed or buried. Within 48 hours, it was the biggest scandal in Brazilian architecture history. The response was immediate and explosive. Arrests began within a week. The owners of all 3 construction companies I'd worked with were detained on charges of corruption, manslaughter, and fraud. Municipal inspectors were suspended and investigated. Engineers who'd falsified structural assessments had their licenses revoked. And the buildings, all 50-plus structures identified in our report as structurally compromised, were evacuated pending comprehensive safety evaluations. 3,000 families displaced overnight, their homes condemned, their investments destroyed. I knew it was necessary. Those buildings were death traps that could collapse at any time. But I also knew that I was the one who designed many of them, that my reputation and my firm's work had given credibility to structures that were fundamentally unsafe. The displaced families were angry, and many of them directed that anger at me. I received death threats. My office was vandalized. Former clients sued me for negligence, claiming I should have known my designs were being compromised. Architectural associations debated whether to revoke my credentials for failing to properly supervise construction of my designs. The media attention was relentless. I gave interviews explaining that I'd been deceived, that the construction companies had systematically modified my designs without my knowledge or approval, that I was also a victim of the conspiracy, but many people didn't believe me. How could an architect of my experience and reputation not know his buildings were being constructed incorrectly? How could I have trusted construction companies so completely that I never verified they were following my specifications? The criticism was valid, and I had no good answers. I'd been naive, trusting, too focused on design and not enough on implementation. I'd assumed that professionals would act professionally, that systems designed to ensure safety would function as intended. And that naivety had contributed to 137 deaths. The legal proceedings took 3 years. The construction company executives received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years for corruption and manslaughter. Municipal officials who'd taken bribes were prosecuted. Inspectors lost their jobs and faced criminal charges. The system of oversight that had failed so spectacularly was reformed, with new regulations requiring independent verification of construction quality and architectural supervision throughout the building process. But the families who'd lost loved ones in structural collapses, and the 3,000 families displaced from condemned buildings, received inadequate compensation. The construction companies claimed bankruptcy, hiding assets in complex corporate structures. Insurance payouts were delayed by legal challenges, and many families ended up with nothing, their investments in homes destroyed, their loved ones dead, their trust in the system shattered. I liquidated my firm to help fund compensation efforts. Everything I'd built over 25 years, gone to try to repair damage I'd unknowingly helped create. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was what I could do. Some families accepted my apology and my money. Others refused, saying I was trying to buy forgiveness for crimes I'd enabled through negligence. Both responses were valid. Throughout this process, I kept returning to one question. How had this happened? How had Brazil's regulatory systems failed so completely that construction companies could systematically compromise buildings for over a decade without being caught? The answer was uncomfortable but clear, because corruption in Brazil operates at every level, because profit is prioritized over safety, because people who should be protecting the public are often the ones betraying them for bribes. Recife's construction boom wasn't unique. Similar patterns existed in São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, every major city experiencing rapid vertical expansion. Architects designing buildings in good faith, construction companies modifying those designs to increase profits, inspectors taking bribes to approve substandard work, and families living in structures that could fail catastrophically at any time. The system was broken, and fixing it required more than prosecuting a few corrupt officials. It required changing the culture of Brazilian construction, creating accountability mechanisms that couldn't be easily corrupted, and acknowledging that rapid development, without proper oversight, was building monuments to progress on foundations of sand. 5 years after the scandal broke, I'm no longer practicing architecture. My license wasn't revoked, but my reputation is destroyed, and no one wants buildings designed by the architect whose work killed over 100 people. I work now as a consultant for engineering firms, reviewing structural plans to identify potential safety issues, using my experience to prevent others from making the mistakes I made. It's unglamorous work that pays a fraction of what I used to earn, but it's meaningful in ways my award-winning designs never were. I also speak publicly about construction corruption, testifying at legislative hearings, consulting with prosecutors investigating similar cases in other cities, helping architectural associations develop better oversight systems. My message is simple. Trust, but verify. Never assume that your designs are being implemented correctly. Never delegate responsibility for safety to others without confirming they're fulfilling that responsibility. And never prioritize aesthetics or profit over structural integrity and human lives. The buildings I designed are part of Recife's skyline now, permanently. Some were demolished after being condemned, others were reinforced and repaired, made safe through expensive retrofitting that the construction companies should have done correctly the first time. But they all carry the memory of what happened, of the people who died because I trusted a corrupt system, of the families who lost everything because cutting corners was more profitable than doing things right. Henrique, the junior architect who documented everything and found the courage to expose it, is still alive despite the threats. He works in building safety inspection now, using his experience to identify structural compromises before they kill people. We meet occasionally, two men who've built second careers from the ruins of our first, bonded by shared guilt over deaths we didn't intend, but failed to prevent. "Do you think we did the right thing?" he asked me recently, exposing everything, even knowing it would destroy careers and displace thousands of families. I thought about the alternative. staying silent while more buildings failed, while more people died, while the corruption continued unchecked. Yes, I said. We did the right thing, but the right thing doesn't erase the wrong that came before it. It doesn't bring back the dead or restore what was lost. It just stops the bleeding and tries to prevent future harm. He nodded, and we sat in silence, two middle-aged men carrying the weight of knowledge we'd rather not have, of responsibilities we'd failed to fulfill, of a system so thoroughly corrupted that fixing it required destroying our own lives in the process. The USB drives that started this are in a safety deposit box now, along with all the evidence Henrique compiled. Insurance against anyone trying to bury the truth again. Proof that can be released if anything happens to either of us. We've made copies, distributed them to journalists and lawyers and prosecutors who've promised to make the information public if we're silenced. It's paranoid, but we've earned our paranoia. The architecture of Recife continues to climb higher, new towers constantly under construction, each one promising luxury and ocean views and urban sophistication. I look at them now and wonder which ones are being built correctly, which ones are being compromised by construction companies, still cutting corners, still bribing inspectors, still prioritizing profit over safety. The reforms that followed our exposé were meaningful, but not comprehensive. The culture of corruption in Brazilian construction is too deep, too profitable, too protected by powerful interests to be eliminated completely. We've made it harder, more expensive, more risky, but we haven't ended it. And that means more buildings will fail, more people will die, more architects will discover too late that their designs were corrupted and their legacies are built on corpses. I carry the names of the 43 people who died in my buildings. I've memorized them, visited their graves when families allowed it, attended memorial services where I wasn't welcome but needed to be present. Roberto Santos, father of 3, killed in the Torre Atlantica balcony collapse. Juliana Costa, 24 years old, crushed when the Torre Marina roof failed. The Mendes family, all 4 of them, dead when their apartment building's foundation gave way and an entire wing collapsed. 43 people who deserved to live in safe homes, who trusted that the buildings they bought were constructed properly, who died because that trust was betrayed by construction companies I'd worked with and inspectors who'd approved substandard work. Their deaths are my responsibility, not because I intended harm, but because I failed to prevent it, because I trusted without verifying, because I was so focused on creating beautiful designs that I didn't ensure they were being built safely. That's the lesson I teach now to architecture students and young professionals. Your responsibility doesn't end when you finish a design. It continues through construction, through occupancy, through the entire life of the building. You must verify that your specifications are being followed, that safety standards are being met, that the people who will live in your creations are protected from harm. And if you discover corruption, if you find that your designs are being compromised, you have a moral obligation to expose it regardless of the cost to your career or reputation. Because buildings aren't just structures, they're homes where families live, where children grow up, where memories are made. And when buildings fail, they don't just collapse physically. They destroy lives, shatter families, betray the trust that makes civilization possible. The architects of Recife and of every city experiencing rapid development carry enormous responsibility. We shape the spaces people inhabit. We determine whether those spaces are safe or dangerous. And we must never forget that our choices, our designs, our oversight or lack thereof can mean the difference between life and death for the people who occupy the buildings we create. I failed that responsibility once. 43 people died because of that failure. I've spent the last 5 years trying to atone, trying to prevent others from making the same mistakes, trying to change a system that makes such mistakes not just possible, but profitable. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's what I have to offer, my experience, my guilt, my determination that no other architect should have to carry the weight I carry, that no other families should have to suffer the losses I helped enable. The city of Recife continues to grow, continues to develop, continues to climb toward the sky on foundations that may or may not be stable. I walk its streets now and see my buildings, some demolished, some reinforced, some still occupied and seemingly safe. And I wonder how many other time bombs are hidden in the city's skyline. How many other architects have unknowingly designed structures that construction companies have compromised? How many other families are living in homes that could collapse at any moment? The water that gives Recife its beauty, the canals and rivers and ocean that make it the Venice of Brazil, also makes its soil unstable, sandy, requiring deeper foundations and stronger structures than inland cities. Building safely here is more expensive, more challenging, more dependent on following specifications exactly, and that makes the temptation to cut corners even stronger, the potential profits from compromised construction even greater. That's why this city became the center of systematic construction corruption, and why the patterns I exposed are likely replicated in other coastal cities across Brazil. We've started a conversation about building safety and construction corruption that extends beyond Recife, beyond any single city. But conversations don't save lives. Actions do. Enforcement does. Cultural change that prioritizes human safety over profit does. And I'm not sure Brazil is ready for that change. Not sure our systems can be reformed enough to prevent the next scandal, the next series of collapses, the next generation of architects discovering their legacies are built on corpses. But I keep working, keep speaking, keep fighting to change what I can. Because the alternative is acceptance, resignation, allowing the corruption to continue unchallenged. And I owe the 43 people who died in my buildings more than that. I owe them resistance, accountability, the knowledge that their deaths weren't ignored or forgotten or accepted as the inevitable cost of progress. Every building I review now, every structural plan I assess, every lecture I give to students about the responsibilities of architecture is a small act of atonement for failures I can never fully repair. It's not redemption. Redemption isn't possible when your mistakes have killed people. But it's something. It's meaning extracted from tragedy, warning born of catastrophe, determination that others might avoid the path I walked. Leonardo Andrade, celebrated architect of Recife's skyline, designer of monuments to progress, creator of structures that killed 43 people through compromised construction, I failed to prevent. That's my legacy, and I carry it every day. In every review I conduct, in every speech I give, in every moment I remember that trust without verification is negligence, that delegation without accountability is abandonment, that creating beauty without ensuring safety is building tombs with pretty facades. The towers of Recife climb higher each year, reaching toward sky above water, built on sand that shifts and settles, on foundations that may or may not hold. And I watch them rise with the knowledge that some will fall, that corruption hasn't ended, that the system that enabled 43 deaths in my buildings continues to operate in modified forms. But I also watch with the hope that our expose made a difference, that some architects learned from my mistakes, that some construction companies decided profit wasn't worth the risk of prosecution, that some families are safer because we had the courage to tell the truth. That hope sustains me through the guilt, through the weight of names I carry, through the knowledge that I can never undo the harm I unknowingly enabled. It's not much, but it's what I have, and it's what I offer to anyone listening. The story of an architect who trusted a corrupt system and learned too late what that trust cost. Learn from my failure. Verify what you're told. Question what you're shown. And never, ever assume that others will prioritize human safety over profit unless you confirm they're actually doing so. The architecture of Brazil is beautiful, ambitious, constantly evolving. But it's also fragile, built too often on compromised foundations, sustained by systems that prioritize appearance over integrity. We can change that. We must change that. Because every building is more than concrete and steel. It's a promise to the people who inhabit it. You are safe here, you are protected. The structure that shelters you was built with care and integrity. When that promise is broken, when buildings become tombs instead of homes, we betray not just the people who die, but the fundamental contract that makes civilization possible. The towers of Recife stand as monuments to both progress and failure, to ambition and corruption, to the beautiful designs I created and the deadly compromises others made. They are my legacy, and I will carry the weight of that legacy until I die. But perhaps, if I work hard enough, if I speak loudly enough, if I change enough minds and prevent enough future failures, that legacy might include not just the mistakes I made, but the efforts I made to repair them. That's not redemption, but it's something. And for now, something is all I have.